Here's a question worth sitting on. What if a prophecy that came true was only written down after the thing it predicted had already happened? 500 years ago, on an island in a lake high in the Valley of Mexico, stood one of the largest cities on earth. Its people told a story about a god who had once lived among them, then left to cross the sea and promised to come back. And when pale, bearded strangers finally appeared on their coast, the timing was so exact that it has haunted us ever since. But the closer you look, the stranger one question becomes: did they truly see it coming? Or did the prophecy only take its final shape later, once everyone already knew how the story ended? To understand why that matters, we can't begin with the strangers. We have to begin with the God. Long before any ship was sighted, the people of central Mexico remembered a golden age. They said that once a ruler had governed them who was unlike anyone before or since. They called him the Feathered Serpent, in their language, Quetzalcoatl. He was no conqueror. The old accounts remember him as a priest and a king who reigned from a shining city called Tula, and that under him there was an abundance of everything a person needed to live, peace and plenty for all. He was the one, they said, who had given them the arts of a settled life, how to craft, how to plant, how to live well together. For a time, his city was the center of the world, and the world was gentle. But every golden age in myth carries the seed of its own ending, and the feathered serpent had a rival. The rival was another god, a darker counterpart, who wanted the shining city for himself. He could not defeat the feathered serpent by force, so he chose something quieter. He came to the aging king as a friend and offered him a medicine, a drink he promised that would restore his strength. But it was no medicine. It was the strong wine of the country, and the king, who had taught his own people to live with restraint, who had built his whole life around being better than his appetites, drank it and lost himself. To understand why a single night could undo him, you have to understand what he had been. He was not only a ruler, he was the model, the living proof that a person could rise above greed and cruelty and excess. His people did not simply obey him, they believed in him. And in one evening, the trick had turned their ideal into just another fallen man. When he woke and understood what he had done, the shame was more than he could carry. He could not stand before the people who had revered him, knowing he had become the very thing he had taught them not to be. So he chose to disappear. He burned the houses he had built. He buried his treasure of gold and precious stones deep in the valleys between the mountains, and he turned east toward the sea. At the shore, the old story says he made himself a raft of serpents and was carried away across the water toward a mysterious land in the east called Tlapalan. The chronicles describe him in a way that is hard to forget, a figure with a fair complexion and a flowing beard, so unlike the people he had ruled. And as he left, he made them a promise that he would return one day with his descendants and take up his kingdom again. Mark, that promise did not fade. It was remembered and it was waited on. His second coming, the old accounts say, was anxiously looked for. All the people watching the eastern sea, waiting for a king who had said he would come home. Now move forward many generations to the years just before the strangers came. According to the chronicles, the empire was troubled by signs that no one could explain. In one year, it is recorded the great lake the city stood on rose without warning and boiled over its banks, flooding the streets of the city. No storm, no earthquake, no cause anyone could see. In the next, a tower of the great temple caught fire in the night and burned on, no matter what they did to put it out. They spoke of a strange light in the east, broad along the horizon, rising to a point like a pyramid of fire, scattering sparks across the sky. They said voices were heard on the wind, low and grieving, as if something were being mourned before it had even happened. Their ruler in those years was a man we remember as Moctezuma, and to him these were not accidents. He is said to have felt that the long destiny hanging over his royal line was finally arriving, and that the throne was about to pass from his house forever. Then the ships came. They appeared on the eastern sea, near the very stretch of coast where, in the legend, the Feathered Serpent had once sailed away, and out of them stepped pale, bearded men, led by a captain whose name was Cortes. And here's the detail that makes the whole story feel like fate. In their sacred calendar, the Feathered Serpent was bound to one particular year sign, a year called One Reed, and the year the ships arrived was a one reed year. So the legend tells us that the people and their ruler believed the returning hero had come home at last, right on schedule, exactly as promised. It is one of the eeriest coincidences in all of history. Which is exactly why we should slow down and ask where this story actually comes from. Because even the older histories that hand us this account add a quiet warning. They note that the ancient prophecy was revived after the fact, with many exaggerated circumstances. Revived, exaggerated. That is a strange way to describe a prophecy that supposedly came true on its own. When historians today go looking for proof that these people expected a god in that exact year, before the strangers ever landed, they find almost none. Nearly every document that tells us Moctezuma mistook the captain for a returning god was written after the conquest was already over, some by the victors, some by elders of the conquered, interviewed decades later, remembering the end of their world through everything that had happened since, which raises an uncomfortable possibility that the prophecy did not foretell the conquest. The conquest produced the prophecy. And if you ask why both sides would tell the same story, the answer is painfully human. For the victors, it was a gift, a conquest that looked less like violence and more like destiny. The land's own gods, it could seem, had handed it over, and for the conquered, it was something else, a way to carry the unbearable. Because to say that an empire of millions fell because it had been foretold, because a god had willed it, is easier to hold than the truth that it fell to strangers and to thousands of its own neighbors who joined them, and to invisible disease that killed without a single battle. A prophecy can be a kind of shelter, a story you build over a wound. So what actually happened? An empire met an invader, and within 2 years it was gone, not by magic, by steel, by alliances, and by sickness no one understood. And then slowly, people reached back into a true and ancient myth about a god who left and promised to return, and they wrapped the catastrophe inside it. The Feathered Serpent was real in the way that myths are real. The promise that he came back in the bodies of those strangers may be the most human invention of all, a story told afterward to make the unbearable mean something. And that is the part the legend never tells you. The most haunting thing about the Feathered Serpent's return is not that a god came back. It is that when everything was lost, a people needed to believe one had. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments which legend we should uncover next. New myths every week here on Untold Myths.